From a serial killer who used Twitter to hunt victims to the famous food critic who secretly cannibalized a college student, this is the official iceberg for Japan's most horrifying serial killers, starting with the surface level killers and going all the way down to the disturbing ones history has forgotten. And first, the mind control killer. It all starts in 1992, and by the end of almost a decade of their reign of terror, the couple Futoshi Matsunaga and Junko Ogata had amassed 9 victims before they were finally captured. But here's the weird twist. The couple didn't just find people and murder them. They forced their victims to move in with them, where they would then torture and kill them. Possibly the worst example of this is Kamiyo Teraya, someone who originally worked with Futoshi and had shared some secrets about his dark past. Instead of offering advice, Futoshi used this information to blackmail Kamiyo, forcing him and his 8-year-old daughter to move in with them. There, the couple abused Kamiyo and his daughter, using methods like electric shock, depriving them of food and sleep. Futoshi even forced Kamiyo's daughter to partially cannibalize him, and the abuse got so bad that the man eventually died after only a year of living there. But Futoshi didn't just exact his control over strangers. His wife's family arguably had it worse than anyone. He blackmailed them into moving in with him. Pretty much did the same thing, abused them, murdered them. Like, it's insane. The family already didn't approve of the two getting married, and then he manipulates, abuses, and extorts them out of over $700,000. But what about the wife? Well, Futoshi forced her to participate in this abuse. Junko had to electrocute her own father until he ended up dying from the abuse. He forced Junko's sister and her husband to strangle their mother to death. He forced the husband to then strangle his own wife to death. And then Futoshi and Junko locked the husband in a bathroom until he starved. If all of that's not bad enough, he forced Junko's 10-year-old niece to murder her 5-year-old little brother. What's crazy is that all of this was going on behind closed doors for almost 10 years. It wasn't until 2002 that this family finally got exposed for their crimes. Remember Kamiyo Teraya, the man who was blackmailed by Futoshi to move in and then tortured to death? His 8-year-old daughter, she escaped after 9 years of being stuck with Futoshi and his wife. She actually escaped twice, once in January of 2002, and then he found her, brought her back, and subjected her to even worse torture. But she was strong. This girl was not giving up. In March, she escaped again. She went to police, and while reporting the crimes to police, Futoshi, in all of his ego, showed up at the police station to try to retrieve this girl, retrieve his victim. Of course, he was arrested instead. I don't know what he thought the outcome of this was going to be. At the time of her escape, the girl was 17. She had lived under the torture of Futoshi and his wife for 9 years. Futoshi was sentenced to death, and as of right now, at 62 years old, he's still sitting in jail, awaiting his execution. I don't know if these two were products of their environment or born monsters, but what I do know is that we've barely scratched the surface. As we continue going down through the levels of our iceberg, we're going to cover a killer midwife, a man who murders over car rentals, and so much more. Next is Kiyotaka Katsuta, a firefighter chief who saved people during the day and committed over 300 crimes in secret. Picture this. It's Japan in the 1970s, a time of economic boom for some, but lurking in the shadows of Kyoto was Katsuta, a man with a facade so deceptive it would probably make you sick if you were there and thinking your neighborhood hero was actually a monster. Katsuta was born into wealth, but endlessly hungry for more. Even at a young age, he'd been a troublemaker, like landing himself in juvie just for repeated charges of petty theft, which just seemed to be a gateway to something way worse. This was a man whose career was built on saving lives, working as a firefighter, supporting his family, almost a local hero, you know, normal husband and father, except he was living a double life the whole time. Katsuta's addiction to luxury, namely cars and women, and probably the thrill of the chase more than anything, really led him down a path of violence. He began to target hostess club women who were basically employed by these clubs to shower their male patrons with attention and provide them with company while they drank. These women would usually leave their places of business with a lot of cash. It was the 70s. Just like a waitress or a stripper or anyone who works in a position like that where they're getting tips, cash is the main form of payment. So Katsuta would wait outside of these clubs until one of the women got off shift and he would attack, kill, and rob them. None of these murders were pinned on him, and it's said it's because of a lack of evidence, but I suspect women who provided services like these in the 70s were not seen by the police as respectable citizens, and maybe they weren't on the top of the list of crimes to solve. But the double life is the most shocking thing, because Katsuta wasn't just any criminal. He was a master of disguise. He was living a respected life in public, diligent at work, eventually even being promoted to firefighter chief, all while his darker self roamed the streets at night, leaving behind a trail of bodies. In 1983, Katsuta was finally captured and confessed to 7 murders, but police think the actual number is somewhere in the 20s. The next case is even more disturbing because we're talking about Yasutoshi Kamata, or the Osaka Ripper. This is a man whose friends and family described him as a friendly and quiet man, but he secretly seduced and murdered 5 women over 10 years. It all started in 1985 in Osaka, Japan, when Kamata extended a seemingly innocent dinner invitation to a 46-year-old woman. Just a normal date that spiraled into unspeakable horror. Once they were inside his apartment, Kamata made the moves on this woman and she rejected him. This rejection threw Kamata into a rage, and it ended in a physical altercation and the woman being strangled to death. But he didn't stop with the killing. He also dismembered the body. This terror spree continued when Kamata lured a college student under the guise of a sushi date, only to replicate the same gruesome scene from the first victim. The boldness of this man escalated with a letter to the police, a challenge written almost as if from a third party with a catch him if you can message that included information that only the murderer would know. Tragically, his next victim was only a child, a 9-year-old girl. His attempts to essay the girl were thwarted by her screams, which led Kamata to panic and kill her. Like his other victims, the girl was strangled. This time he did not dismember her, but discarded her body in the mountains, and later he'd explain that the reason he didn't dismember her was because her body was small enough to fit in a box without being cut up. He then had the audacity to call her school and ask for ransom money in exchange for her return. At one point, Kamata ended up being imprisoned, but not for murder. He was actually arrested for some robberies, and that put a pause on his killing spree, but prison did not deter him. As soon as he was released, he found 2 more victims and treated them the same way that he had done with the first 2, strangling them to death and dismembering their bodies. His reign of terror against women finally ended in 1995, 10 years after it started, when a trail of evidence, including a fingerprint on that threatening letter and bodies that had been discovered, ended up linking back to Kamata. In 2016, Kamata was executed for his crimes, and the book was finally closed on the story of the Osaka Ripper. The otaku murderer is next. In 1988, Tsutomu Miyazaki had just turned 26, and instead of going out for drinks to celebrate with his friends or spending some time with his family, he decided that his first act in his new year would be abducting a 4-year-old girl. Miyazaki lured the girl into his car and drove west, hanging out with her for around a half an hour before killing and defiling her body. He then kept the girl's hands and feet as sick trophies of what he'd done. But if the horror he put this girl through in life and death wasn't bad enough, he also burned parts of her body and sent the ashes to her family with a note basically taunting them to try to catch him. Now, this was just the first victim in Miyazaki's spree. In all, he abducted, murdered, and abused the body bodies of 4 young girls between the ages of 4 and 7. He brought the body of one of his victims back to his apartment and took photos and videos of defiling that he committed on her body. He also kept the hands and feet from this one and admitted later that it was so he could drink the blood from the hands and eventually eat them. It seems as though Miyazaki's descent into darkness had accelerated after his grandfather passed away. He had been the only remaining family member that he felt a connection with, and afterwards, after his death, Miyazaki felt extremely isolated. I feel like there is a very obvious theme of isolation when it comes to many of these killers that we cover. It was a theme in our last video, and it's definitely not going to end here, so Miyazaki was captured on July 23rd, 1989 after he attempted another abduction but failed. When the police investigated his home, they found thousands of videotapes, including footage and photos of his victims. Obviously, these crimes, initially called the little girl murders, caused widespread panic in Japan. But once Miyazaki was captured, the case also created criticism against otaku culture because of his obsession with anime and horror. Now, otaku is really just a word that means obsession. It means you're really into a topic. It's usually used to talk about things like anime and manga, but basically expresses an interest in something to the point where it consumes you. In this case, forensic evidence played a crucial role with his conviction. The DNA and fiber analysis connected him with the crimes, but ultimately it was Miyazaki's documentation and confession that sealed his fate. Despite the defense trying to claim insanity, Miyazaki was found mentally competent and aware of his crimes. I mean, he literally sent a letter to one of the families asking them to investigate him. He knew what he was doing was a crime. Miyazaki's death sentence was carried out on June 17th, 2008, and that will round off the tip of our iceberg. Now we're going to go below the surface, starting with Norio Nagayama. Nagayama was born into a life of poverty and neglect. He was the 7th of 8 siblings and grew up in a home that was overshadowed by an alcoholic father and constant financial struggles. Like, literally had to eat leftovers from people's garbage sometimes to survive, that kind of poverty. While Nagayama was in junior high, his dad passed away and he started stealing. Now, I'd like to think that maybe there were good intentions there, like he had seen his mother struggle even when his father was alive, and now she would be stuck supporting 8 children by herself. Maybe he wanted to contribute. But whatever the reason, his mother kicked him out of the house because of it. After that, Nagayama headed to Tokyo with the hopes of a fresh start. Unfortunately, his past followed him, so he had a record of petty crimes, and that record made it almost impossible for him to get a job, and so with no home and no way to make money in an honest way, Norio started stealing again. In cases like these, sometimes you have to wonder, how does a person like this, who starts from a really tough beginning, escape that cycle? Nagayama actually ended up going to jail for a bit after vandalizing a vending machine on an American army base. His family wrote him while he was in jail, and once he was released, he actually got a job, started studying to get into university. So it sounded like he was on his way to breaking that cycle. Except he ended up skipping out on his responsibilities because of his deteriorating emotional state. At this point, he was essentially homeless again, unable to find a job, and things started to spiral out of control. He wasn't looking to hurt people at first, but to hurt himself. He wanted a way to die. So Nagayama stole a .22 caliber revolver from a military base, and having this weapon made something in him snap. He felt powerful for the first time, like he was finally in control. Instead of turning that weapon on himself, or I think the original plan was unaliving by cop, with that weapon in hand and that powerful feeling, he changed tactics. Nagayama unleashed a spree of violence, leaving 4 people dead. Out of all that violence, I I don't know if this is irony or karma at this point, but out of all of that violence and all of the victims, all he managed to steal was about 16,000 yen, which is barely $100. Nagayama was captured on April 7th, 1969, and sentenced to death for his crimes. His sentence was overturned and then reinstated, sparking a nationwide debate. Before his actual execution, Nagayama turned his troubled mental state into writing and ended up publishing several novels and becoming almost more well known for his writing than his actual crimes. On August 1st, 1997, Norio Nagayama was executed, and per the request of his will, a foundation to save those destroyed by poverty was established by his estate. Next, we have Japan's first recorded serial killer, Satoru Fukiage. And again, another one whose home life wasn't exactly fun and games. He lived a pretty twisted life that started with a childhood that was anything but ordinary. Satoru was the eldest of 6 children, and as a child, he had to watch his father, who was a weaver of the famed Nishijin textile, basically toil endlessly for a very meager living. If you're not familiar with Nishijin, it's a silk fabric. It's been around for like 1200 years, known for creating highly decorative designs commonly seen in kimono and obi, and even today it's used in like traditional Japanese ceremonies like weddings. But the crafting of the actual designs is very tedious. So his father, underpaid and overworked, started drowning his sorrows in alcohol. His mother also drank often, and the two would frequently have relations in front of their children, which is just so inappropriate. I can't imagine how that scarred them. When Satoru was only 11, he was sent away to work, where he had to perform manual labor for 18 hours a day on very little sleep. He was abused when he underperformed, and he was R-worded by a coworker and eventually fired from that job because their relationship was discovered. At 12 years old, he was sent to jail for stealing. He later said that he preferred it in jail because while locked up, he got 3 meals a day, didn't have to work for 18 hours, and didn't get abused. It's not the first time that we've heard stories like that of inmates who prefer to be locked up because they'll always have a roof over their head. While he was in prison, he also started to learn math from some of the adult inmates, so he was trying to learn a marketable skill. He was released eventually and ended up being homeless again at 16 until he became involved with a 50-year-old woman who took him in as she was kind of his sugar mama. But even though he had a relationship with this woman, while living with her, he also assaulted her daughter and 2 of her daughter's friends. When he was 17, Fukiage lured an innocent 11-year-old to a temple under the guise of catching fireflies. He ended up killing her. The 50-year-old woman told him to flee, but he was too scared. A part of me wonders if he didn't want to run because he wanted to go back to the safety of prison. Satoru was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 19 and released when he was 34 years old. There's something there that has to do with the era in Japan switching over and everybody getting pardons, but Satoru was one of the people who was pardoned when he was 34. But despite being in prison for all that time, he again didn't learn his lesson. No matter what happened after he was released, he couldn't turn his life around. He would change his name, move to a new city, but everywhere he went, he would continue to assault young women. That's not how you turn your life around. When he was finally arrested again, he confessed to 91 assaults and 13 murders. He showed no remorse for his actions and was sentenced to death. He did try to leave behind a legacy on the page, writing an autobiography from behind bars. Unfortunately for Fukiage, and fortunately for the rest of us, including the families of his victims, that book was immediately banned. Now, while Satoru Fukiage wanted to leave behind a legacy of his life, our next story is about a man shrouded in mystery, attempting to blend into the shadows of post-war Japan. Akira Nishiguchi's story kicks off in Fukuoka, and spirals into the bustling streets of Tokyo between October and December of 1963. But before the chaos, a young Nishiguchi was a good religious boy, whisked away to Goto Island and raised in the strict confines of the Catholic school. His parents actually dreamed of him becoming a priest. Can you imagine? Well, Akira couldn't. He wanted to walk a darker path. So he dove into a life of stealing and scamming and spiraled out of control into a cycle of juvenile detentions. Fast forward a bit and we find him as a family man, except things haven't really improved. He's a husband gone rogue, engulfed in an affair, and drowning in debt. Now, this is where the tale turns gruesome. To settle his debts, Nishiguchi's sinister side surfaced. He committed cold-blooded murder not once but twice, leaving behind a trail of blood and betrayal, because these weren't strangers that he decided to kill for their money. They were people he knew, acquaintances. He made off with around 270,000 yen, which again, only around 2,000 US dollars. Even with time and inflation, that's less than $10,000 today. I'm not saying $10,000 isn't a lot, but for murder, to potentially lose your life or spend your life in prison. But he wasn't worried. Akira was already suspected by the police, but he had a plan. It was fine. He wrote a fake suicide note, put it in his pants pocket, threw those pants overboard the side of a ship with a pair of his shoes, and that was it, right? Like, the cops will find that, know he killed himself, end of story. Cops weren't convinced though, not when they couldn't find a body or any other sign of one. So Nishiguchi flits from one disguise to another while the police are still trying to track him down. He plays the role of doting boyfriend in one place, scamming courthouse accountant in another, and counterfeit lawyer in yet another, thieving and sometimes murdering along the way. He was finally arrested in Kumamoto when the 10-year-old daughter of an educator he was attempting to scam noticed his fake badge and also recognized him from a wanted poster. The father wasn't quite convinced. He spoke to police and the police said, "Here's a way to figure it out. He should have a scar on his chest. If you can find that, then it's our man." So this dad invited Nishiguchi over to a bathhouse in the morning, but he had the space where the scar would be covered. It didn't matter. The cops were waiting for them when they got back from the bathhouse anyway, and he was arrested on January 3rd, 1964, and sentenced to death. The educator continued to write him letters while he was in prison and on death row, apparently wanting to understand his mind or something. His death sentence was carried out in 1970. For this next one, we're being introduced to the first female killer on our iceberg, Miyuki Ishikawa. Imagine, if you will, a respected midwife, adorned with multiple certificates and a beacon of hope in the ravaged city of post-war Tokyo. This is a woman whose job is to make women feel safe in one of the most vulnerable times of their lives. She's there to make sure that everything goes smoothly and they don't need to worry. But beneath the facade of respected midwife, Ishikawa had a heart of darkness. It all started in Kotobuki Senin, not just a maternity home, but the stage for one of Japan's most harrowing stories. Here, Ishikawa began to prey on the vulnerable, on mothers too impoverished to dream of a future for their babies. While operating under the guise of someone meant to help them through their pregnancies, she exploited the dire lack of foster care, choosing neglect over nurture, and resulting in countless infant deaths. Ishikawa wasn't alone in this. She had accomplices to her deeds, including her own husband, Takeshi, and a doctor named Shiro Nakayama. The three of them traded lies for cash under the guise of mercy, preying on the desperate. So they would extort these women for their money because they had convinced them that it was cheaper than having to raise a child. Now, raising a child is very expensive, okay? It's very expensive. And with the lack of foster care, I understand that this was dire straits. But murder is a little extreme. Thankfully, the remains of some of these young victims began to surface in 1948, and the dark deeds of this maternity home were discovered. But justice seemed weak. Sentences that hardly fit the severity of the crimes came down on these 3 people, despite being responsible for more than 80 infant deaths. Ishikawa and her husband were only sentenced for 5 of the murders, and they only served a few years in prison. We're leaving behind the cultural heart of Japan for a moment so we can stroll the streets of Paris with Issei Sagawa. Issei was born prematurely to wealthy parents, and he grew up with a lot of sicknesses, and he was weak. He grew from these fragile beginnings into a boy with a passion for art and literature, except his passions extended to something else that was really disturbing, the desire to eat human meat. This wasn't really a well-kept secret either. He confessed to a school counselor that he had these desires, and they played it off as if it was some weird hallucination from puberty. Ignoring warning signs like this is how a red flag turns into a horror story. So keep that in mind for the future. You know that saying that people tell you exactly who they are, exactly what kind of person they are? In Paris, where he went to study abroad, Issei's fantasies finally breached the realm of reality. He met a Dutch student and lured her to his apartment under the guise of needing some help with a school assignment. He wanted someone to help him translate. He's Japanese, she's Dutch. She offered to help. She was happy to help, except Issei didn't really need her help. He was pretty good with English, and also as soon as she sat down in his apartment, he shot her in the head. Then he had relations with her body, mutilated it, and proceeded to consume her over the next several days. But not at first, because one thing that Issei overlooked in his fantasies was that his teeth wouldn't be sharp enough to break through the skin and flesh of her body. And he didn't have a knife sharp enough to do it, strong enough to do it, so he had to go buy one first. He also documented the process in photos. Don't go looking them up. I mean, I'm not your mom. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you shouldn't. You shouldn't go look them up. And if you do, I warned you. Once the victim began to decompose, Issei transported the remaining pieces of her in a couple of suitcases down to a park where he was presumably gonna toss them. But a curious bystander was suspicious of the whole scene and called the police. Instead of taking the evidence with him, Issei left the suitcases there and ran. He was found 4 days later, and that should have been the end of it. He had murdered someone in cold blood, very premeditated, like back since first grade premeditated. First, Issei was found legally insane and unfit to stand trial, likely thanks to the very pricey lawyer that his father hired for his defense. So he was held in a mental institution where he dictated his story to an author who published it later, and that ended up launching Issei's celebrity. He almost became better known for this book than for the actual crime he committed. Eventually, he was deported and committed to a different hospital back in Tokyo, where he was found sane. And since the French court documents were never released to Japanese authorities, which means that Issei couldn't legally be charged for this crime in Japan. And so he was able to check himself out of the hospital in 1986. Issei was a free man until his death in 2022. Now, we don't have any proof of any other crimes that were committed during his freedom, but he did frequently appear in the media afterwards, either as like a commentator on different shows or by writing more books. He also wrote restaurant reviews. Imagine hiring a cannibal to be your food critic. Next, we're heading back to Tokyo for the case of Yoshio Kodaira. It's just after World War II, and things are intense, as I'm sure you can imagine. Enter Kodaira, not your average Joe. His backstory, not great. As a kid, he's got a speech impediment that really feeds his insecurities. But he grows up, he joins the Navy, and things, well, they don't get better. Kodaira was part of the Jinan incident, which was a dispute between Chinese and Japanese forces that began with the deaths of Japanese civilians and launched into a full-scale attack on the Chinese troops, resulting in the deaths of thousands. Kodaira was personally responsible for some of those deaths, though the number is unknown, and it was reported that he also R-worded many women while in China. When he came back from the war, things were a mess. His wife, he was married before all of this, left him because, and I know you're shocked to hear this, but he cheated. Kodaira isn't just heartbroken over the end of his marriage, he's outright vengeful. He attacks his wife's family in a rage, killing his father-in-law. But he's not done. Kodaira continues to take out his anger on innocent women by luring them under the pretense of offering food or work. Like I said, this is after World War II and things are hard. So this seems like a good offer. A man, you know, he's a soldier, he's respected in the military, and he's offering you a boon, really. Between 1945 and 1946, Kodaira lured at least 7 women into the forest, R-worded, and murdered them. On August 20th, 1946, he was arrested and convicted for those 7 women, but there were definitely more. When he was questioned about his crimes, he was almost excited to recount them, even exposing himself to the interrogator. He said, "I know many people who did terrible things during the war, but I don't think anyone has ever done such terrible things during a time of peace." Like, he was proud of it. Kodaira was executed on October 5th, 1949, but he left behind a statement asking forgiveness for his soul. Maybe he was sorry after all. The next case is a modern nightmare. The case of the Twitter killer, Takahiro Shiraishi. Quiet dude, typical loner vibes, hopping from one job to another without much fuss. He's not making any waves, not calling too much attention to himself. Remember how we talked about isolation earlier? Keep that in mind. Shiraishi takes a deep dive into Tokyo's red light district, gets caught up in some shady business, and his reputation takes a serious nosedive. Now, some people might sulk and move on, but not Shiraishi. He takes to Twitter. We all know that's a terrible idea, especially in the past few years. He's lurking in the darkest corners, preying on people at their lowest, and I'm sure we've all seen the type. It's not hard to find a real garbage human on that website. So he's got this twisted setup where he's convincing people he's their exit buddy, you know, like they're gonna log off of life together. Yeah, except he's got his own plan. He's luring them in to promise them peace, an end to whatever nightmare they think they're suffering, whatever is too hard to move on from, but he's giving them a new nightmare instead. Not the peaceful, painless death he'd been peddling online. No, his first victim he drugged, R-worded, strangled her, and then cut up her body based on instructions that he found on the internet. Later, he ran into her boyfriend and panicked, thinking the guy had somehow tracked him from his Twitter account. So he was also invited up to Shiraishi's apartment, murdered, and dismantled in the same way as his girlfriend. But he wasn't done. Shiraishi continued offering this service, and in the span of 2 months, he had drugged, assaulted, and killed 7 other women, stealing money from all of them. Police started investigating because that's a bunch of missing women, and they found a lead about a man online who was contacting women with unaliving desires. Eventually, they follow the lead to Shiraishi's apartment, and what do they find? Bones, organs, and the heads of all 9 of his victims in coolers preserved with cat litter. In 2017, Shiraishi was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. He is still awaiting his execution. We're not leaving the dark corners of the internet yet, because next is the case of the suicide website murders. This is the case of Hiroshi Maeue. Hiroshi suffered from paraphilic psychosexual disorder, and that's just a fancy way of saying that he experienced arousal from situations that most people would think are not normal. This can mean a lot of things, and I'm not here to kink shame. It meant he was unable to reach orgasm without performing an act of strangulation. Not just a little choking. This is strangled to death, not your everyday kind of problem. Hiroshi, like many of the people we've talked about so far, his life spirals. He drops out of university, he gets fired for, well, attempting to strangle people, and just when you think he's done, he's back at it. Not once, but twice more. Hiroshi turns to the web, and he finds a suicide club. Going into this, I wasn't really sure what a suicide club was, and when I looked into it, I found a secret society in San Francisco and a movie. And then Google warned me about what I was doing, and I don't want the FBI watching my computer to get the wrong idea. So I'm assuming, like the Twitter account that Shiraishi was dealing with, that this was a place where people with suicidal suicidal tendencies would gather and talk to one another. In any case, he lured the members of the club, and this was a 14-year-old boy, a 25-year-old woman, and a 21-year-old man, to a meeting place and promised a communal farewell, unaliving by carbon monoxide in a car. He didn't let them complete the act, however, strangling and killing all three after just a brief conversation. Later, he confessed that the murders gave him pleasure and blamed this desire on reading mystery novels as a child. If everyone who read mystery novels needed to murder someone in order to get off, I think there'd be a lot more murder, because mystery is a very popular genre. Hiroshi was dubbed a lust murderer and was sentenced to death, and his execution was carried out in 2009. There's a lot to unpack below the surface, but we're not done yet. We have more layers of depravity to explore. We're gonna dive into the deeper waters, starting with the drumstick killer. This story is pretty out there. Sachiko Eto was not your average neighbor in Fukushima. I mean, her life started off pretty standard, but when her father died when she was young, she was basically left to raise herself. Despite this hardship, she toughed it out during childhood. She grew up, she landed a job, she met someone, fell in love, and they got married, and they had some kids. So she did it, right? Pulled herself up from her bootstraps, as they say, and she made it work. Happy story, happy life. Not quite. Her husband got into an accident and ended up with a bad back, and on top of that, he had gambling debts. Her daughter got sick. It seemed like every turn her life took, there was a bump in the road. So they did what any normal family would do in this situation. They joined a cult. The cult presented themselves as having the ability to heal things through prayer. So they prayed for her husband's injury to be healed, and it worked. It worked. His back pain was gone, but so was he after a while, because he met someone in the cult and cheated. When he left, Eto was left with the mortgage. She prayed that her husband would come back, but during her prayer, she realized that wasn't her praying. She felt like a paranormal sensation. Eto thinks she's had some kind of spiritual awakening. So she starts her own cult, obviously, convinces people she's got this magic touch, and suddenly she's the star of her own show. What is this magic touch, you might wonder? Talking to people. She reaches out to people from her childhood and that she grew up with and people in her community, and they talk to her about their problems, and she helps them heal their trauma. Not through some supernatural or paranormal method. She's just a therapist, basically. But no, she becomes a cult leader. People are paying her. People are loving her. They're living with her. It sounds like a dream, right? Coming from a place where you've been betrayed and abandoned, and now you have a community of people loving you. You can see the appeal. So she has a commune that she creates with some of her followers. There are 10 of them in total. But of course there's a twist, because when it comes to cults, it's not just love. That love turns into a sort of power, and that power can turn into madness. Eto and her new beau, because she met and fell in love with a new member of this new cult, they start playing God, and not in a fun way. They started to abuse the followers. It started with people who voiced concerns about their relationship, but it expanded from there. She dubbed this abuse as exorcisms. They weren't. She would abuse people from restricting their food intake, restricting their ability to sleep, restricting their ability to use the bathroom. 2 of these members ended up dying as a result. But Eto, she assured the rest of the followers that God was taking care of these people's souls. But then she continued killing other followers in this same manner. You might be wondering why she's called the drumstick killer. Well, apparently these exorcisms, they involve chanting and using drumsticks to beat the followers senseless. The aim of this, apparently, or at least the story she was selling, was to kill the dirty body and purify the soul by driving out the ugly devils. I don't know what the ugly devils were. It seems like just a term for them disagreeing with her, but things got out of control when followers started dropping like flies. What was left was a house of horror and a police raid. And that was the end of the road for Eto, because she landed on death row, convicted of 6 murders, and making history as one of Japan's rare female executions. Next, we have a tale that takes us to the streets of Hiroshima and to some pretty dark corners of the human psyche. Hiroaki Hidaka was a guy whose life was pretty uneventful. He had good grades as a kid, he was doing okay, but he really didn't have a clear path or any real ambition in life. Sometimes that's all it takes, a lack of direction that makes it all too easy to veer off course and take the wrong route, you know? So he drifts to the darker side. Addiction, gambling, drinking, the kind of stuff he keeps quiet because he's not proud of it. Doesn't want to admit the way it consumes him, you know? Eventually, Hidaka becomes a taxi driver. So he's got a job. Things are probably looking up, right? Not really. He's giving rides to businessmen and women, people going to work in suits and with briefcases, and frankly, he's feeling a bit inferior. But he feels superior, like he's better than these people, so why should they get the good jobs? Why should they be making better money? On top of all of this, because of his gambling problem, he's drowning in debt. Love enters the scene and he gets married, and he and his wife decide to start a family, but it's not a light at the end of the tunnel for Hidaka. His wife, suffering from extreme postpartum depression, decides to take the baby and leave and go stay with her family until she's feeling better. But her departure leaves Hidaka feeling alone and depressed. And so he falls back into his addictions. Now, instead of doing what he can to try to turn things around in his wife's absence, you know, he's still got all of this debt. You would think he would try to improve that before she comes back so he can present to her a stronger foundation for their future. No, he decides to spend more money. So Hidaka joined a website that's basically intended for like sugar daddies, you know? Like the idea is older men are paying younger women money for dates, etc. But Hidaka doesn't really have any money, so, you know, he's got debt up to his ears. So the first woman he hires through this website, she has to cut their date short because she has a bill that she has to pay, 100,000 yen, and she needs to get there by a certain time. So he thinks, she's got 100,000 yen on her. The payment I need to make for my debt this week is 150,000 yen. If I kill her, I can take that money and I'll be set, because I also just gave her 20,000 yen for this date. I'll be almost there. So he murders her, expecting her to have that money she talked about on her. She doesn't. She doesn't even have half of it. She has 50,000 yen, which means she had the 20,000 he gave her and just 30,000 extra. At some point, Hidaka's wife finds out about all this debt and she files for divorce. This also doesn't stop him. He returns to that website and repeats the same process with more women. He's reasoning that he'll eventually get caught and executed, so why stop? You know, no consideration for the actual lives he's taken or whatever they're leaving behind. He does get caught, not because of the website, but because he ends up inviting out a friend of a friend. So this website isn't enough. He wants to target someone that he knows has money, but he's targeting someone who also has a link back to him. So he's about to strangle her like he had with the other women, and she sees what's happening and fights him. She still doesn't survive, but unlike the other women, this one can actually be tied back to him, and so when she's reported missing, he's arrested. As expected, Hidaka is sentenced to death for the murder of 4 women. Next, we have the story of Tomohiro Kato and the Akihabara massacre. Kato grew up under intense pressure from his parents, and this isn't unusual. Japanese parents are known for being strict about their kids' academic studies, but this was definitely an extreme, things that most people would consider abuse, such as being forced to eat scraps from the floor or standing in the snow for hours. But the story really takes place in 2008, when Kato was 25 years old. As an adult, Kato isn't really getting anywhere in life. Jobs just aren't clicking, debts are piling up, his personal life is in disrepair, but it's okay though. It's okay because, like many at that time, he finds fascination in the internet. Finally, some connection, some understanding from the digital world. Online, he can find people who are just like him, no matter how far away. He can find people who share in his interests, and he doesn't have to put on airs or pretend to be something he's not. Kato's online haven turns sour pretty quickly. Friends start to withdraw, and soon he's feeling more invisible than ever. Remember how we keep talking about isolation? Now, Kato, lost and desperate for some form of recognition, decides to take matters into his own hands. He's thinking if he can't be someone in life, maybe he'll make a mark through death. It's twisted, but he's not the first to feel this way, judging by the stories we've already covered, and I'm sure he won't be the last. On the day of the crime, Akihabara becomes a scene of chaos. Kato rents a truck, and behind the wheel, he drives into a crowd, initially killing 3 people and injuring 2. Then, he leaves the truck behind, and on the street, he attacks 12 more people with a dagger, killing 4. After this tragedy, police found some online posts from before the attack. They left behind a chilling cry for help from a man who felt like he'd lost everything. "I will kill people in Akihabara," one message said, while another said, "I don't have a single friend, and I won't in the future." Kato was referred to as hikikomori, which is a term used in Japan for severe social withdrawal. And I think that can apply to a lot of these cases. The term is used both for the state of severe social withdrawal and also for the individuals who, I don't want to say suffer from it because it's not really a disorder. It's kind of their own doing. In the end, Kato was charged with the murder of 7 victims and sentenced to death in 2011. He was executed in July of 2022. Next, we're talking about Shojiro Nishimoto, a man who was born in the lap of luxury, the kind of guy you think would have it all. But life is never quite that black and white, and for him it wasn't this simple. After Nishimoto's parents split up, he started down a slippery slope. From just lazy slacker to injured worker, he became the perceived main character in this tragic story where he felt like anything that could go wrong would. At one point, he tries to pull himself together. He gets married, but under false pretenses, telling his wife-to-be that he's some hotshot business owner. He's racking up debt and he owes a lot of money to car rental companies. And well, desperate times call for desperate measures. So one night, he runs out of gas, literally and figuratively. Like, he's had enough, run out of steam, but also his car literally ran out of gas. So he hails a cab. Since he doesn't have the money for the cab, he beheads the driver over something like what would be $100. But that's not the end of it, because now he's on a roll. He starts breaking into homes, stabbing the residents and stealing from them. First, it's a 77-year-old woman. From her, he gets 15,000 yen. Then a 69-year-old man. That one, he walks away with 260,000 yen, which is still not even $2,000, but... And finally, a 74-year-old woman. Nishimoto's misstep in this whole spree comes in the form of a failed burglary and a blaring security alarm. So, with his back against the wall, he spills the beans, all of them. But then he also offers a fake confession for a murder he didn't commit and later admits that it's a lie, finds himself on death row, and joins a cast of inmates executed on January 29th, 2009. Now we're descending even darker into the depths of our iceberg, diving down into the abyss with the case of Gen Sekine, a story that brings a whole new meaning to the term man's best friend. It all started in 1993. Sekine was a man running a thriving pet shop and leasing business named the Africa Kennel, but he was playing a deadly game behind the scenes. Sekine was taking pets in and deciding their fate in the most horrific way. Like, he'd literally poison these pets, innocent animals, just so he could sell new, healthier animals to his customers. So it sounds like these depraved acts are just for money, right? Maybe that's how it started. But eventually, Sekine decides he's not just content with furry victims, and he escalates, as people tend to do. 4 customers vanish, seemingly into thin air, and whispers start swirling around the shop. What's happening behind the closed doors of the Africa Kennel? Sekine apparently has a grudge list longer than you can imagine. I don't know why, because people said he's so charming. But apparently he gets into it with his customers, their tensions with the Yakuza. Like, I don't know. I thought he was just a pet shop owner and murderer. Sekine is brewing a concoction of pure evil, strychnine nitrate, a poison so vile that it can kill almost immediately after consumption. Whatever it does to the body, you can't breathe. It causes asphyxiation. So he's forcing people to drink this poison, but it gets even darker, if you can believe it, the disposal of the bodies. Sekine with the help of his wife and a reluctant employee. I don't know how you can come out of this and say I was a reluctant partner in all of this, because you knew murders were happening and you came to work every day and didn't call the cops. They turn his bathtub into a cleanup scene. Sekine, along with his accomplices, they dismember these bodies, cutting down the pieces until they're no larger than several centimeters, and, well, they incinerate the bones, and they start disposing of them out, like, in the forest. If the employee is reluctant, does that mean the wife is a willing, enthusiastic participant? So the collapse of the economic bubble that had existed in Japan in the 80s and early 90s, it really hit Sekine hard. His world was crumbling, but his crimes were still in the shadows for a long time, until the police shift their focus in his direction. They follow a lead and find bone fragments and personal effects like car keys and watches in the forest and the Nuri River. Because of the incineration, DNA testing was pretty much impossible, but the personal items, some of those made it so police could identify the victims. At the trial, Sekine and his wife immediately turned on each other, making the prosecutor's job very difficult, and the employee who had originally tipped them off refused to testify, claiming that the prosecutor had made him a deal and then went back on it. Now, the prosecutor said that never happened, but because of that, the employee refused to testify against Sekine and his wife. This trial lasted over 100 court sessions and spanned more than 5 years before the couple was finally sentenced to death. They were sentenced on 4 counts of murder, but suspected of at least 3 more. Let's shift gears a bit to the story of Satoshi Uematsu and the Sagamihara stabbings. Uematsu's life reads like a cautionary tale. As a kid, he used to pass by a care facility for disabled people every day, seeing faces he'd remember for all the wrong reasons. During his school days, he even presented a case to his class about how he didn't think the world needed disabled people. But later, Uematsu seemed to make a promising choice. He dove deep into studies surrounding social work, aiming to become a teacher, almost as if he'd had a change of heart. Maybe he wanted to really help people with disabilities. Spoiler alert, that is not what he wanted to do. Somewhere along the way, Uematsu took a dive into the underworld of Japan, getting involved in drugs and gang life, a far cry from the kid who dreamed of being a teacher when he grew up. And then in some twist of fate, he ended up working at the very same care facility that he used to walk by every day. His teaching license had gotten him in the door. Uematsu couldn't stand helping these patients. He was very disgusted by the thought of having to wash them or help them use the bathroom. This disdain had started earlier in life, as we know, when he was walking past every day, but the frustration over the way these patients were so dependent on other people grew into a deep hatred. Uematsu began to abuse the patients, and this started with verbal abuse, but he did escalate into being physically rough with them. He got scolded for this, he got in trouble at work, but he didn't get fired. Now, at this point, he's working at this place with these people he hates, and he's not just unhappy, he's completely disillusioned. He starts to get caught up on all the wrong ideas, watching too much TV, getting hooked on some pretty out there theories. He's becoming intrigued with things like ISIS and the way Donald Trump is presenting things. Suddenly, he gets this grand plan, and it's nothing short of horrifying. His plan starts mildly enough. Some letters sent to some people in government positions, suggesting some pretty radical changes, like hiring the Yakuza to work in the military, and how euthanizing disabled people would bring Japan peace and prevent another world war. Unsurprisingly, the recipients of these letters sent them to the cops, and the cops sure did warn his job about some of his thoughts on disabled people. So Uematsu was fired, but one night after losing his job, he breaks into the care facility, and what follows is just unimaginable. hospital. He restrains the staff and walks through the facility with a knife. He tests each of the patients. If they can understand and respond to him in some way, they're safe. If not, he stabbed and killed them. Before the police were called, he had killed nearly 20 people and injured 26 others. It's not anyone's fault, other than Uematsu's, that it took so long for the police to get there. Remember, he restrained the staff, and it took one of the employees breaking free from the restraints to get the cops on the phone. Uematsu confessed to his crimes and was sentenced to death in March of 2020. Even at his trial, he reaffirmed the belief that disabled people were less than human and shouldn't be allowed to live. As of today, he still awaits execution. This next one is pretty unnerving. This is the case of Kiyoshi Okubo. You might think that Okubo was destined to be pretty messed up. With a perverted father, the guy would regularly perform sex acts in front of children. Okubo's own antics were not your typical childhood fare either. In 6th grade, he got in trouble for stuffing stones into a female classmate's genitals. His mom defended him for this too. On top of this stuff, Okubo was bullied a lot as a kid. I mean, that's the least surprising thing I found out about this guy considering the rest of it. But he dropped out of high school and flitted from job to job, getting fired for stuff like keeping into the woman's bath at a bathhouse or stealing from a repair shop. At one point, Okubo pretended to be a university student and R-worded a high school girl. He was arrested, but that didn't stop him because he attempted to do the same thing to someone else. Luckily, she fought back and he was not successful, and he spent 3 years in prison for that one. When he was released, Okubo met a woman and wanted to marry her, but he concealed his criminal record. She found out when he got arrested for extortion and was sentenced to another year in prison. In 1971, when Okubo was in his mid-30s, and after another stint in prison and a separation from his wife, he began cruising around in his Mazda and basically catcalling women. It's said that he would call out to over 100 women per day, and maybe 30 would get in. When the women got in the car, he would try to coerce them into having sex with him. But if they resisted, he would kill them. In the span of 2 months, Okubo murdered 8 women this way, all between the ages of 16 and 21. The real hero of this story is actually the brother of one of the victims. He actually caught Okubo trying to wipe fingerprints off from his car. So he takes down the license plate number and he gives it to the police. Okubo actually plays games with the police before he'll give them any information about where the bodies are. He would make demands in exchange for revealing a location, but eventually he ends up with a death sentence. Like many people, because I guess they don't have much else to do, while on death row, Okubo wrote a book. One of the things he says in that book is, "I am seen as having lost myself and become only a beast of sexual desire, but I don't care about that." He did not appeal his sentencing, and Okubo was executed on February 22nd, 1973. Now, there have been a lot of death sentences covered in this video, but let's talk about some injustice. This one starts in 1990 in Ashikaga. A little girl named Mami Matsuda was just hanging out in a pachinko parlor with her dad. Now, pachinko is a low-stakes gambling game, kind of like a slot machine. To me, it seems like a weird place to take your small child, especially because I think you can still smoke in a pachinko parlor. So Mami, only 4 years old at the time, vanishes. 1 minute she's there, and the next, gone. This is the kind of thing that's so scary as a parent because little kids, especially around that age, they have a habit of wandering. So the whole town is on edge, and the police are on a manhunt, and then a lead. They find Mami, but it's too late. Enter Toshikazu Sugaya, our unlikely protagonist in this story. Now, he's just a regular guy, a bus driver, someone you normally wouldn't look at twice, but his world was about to be turned upside down because the police are desperate for answers, and they latch onto him like he's the key to solving all of their problems. Why him, you ask? Well, it gets weird. So there's DNA on this girl, and they decide to test all the people around the pachinko parlor, looking for the same blood type, type B. Sugaya had been reported as being suspicious, and not only did he have the right blood type, but they also found mountains of Lolita porn in his place. It's not children, but films made with very young actresses. The implication is that they're supposed to kind of look like children, so that's all they have to go on. They convict Sugaya, and he's imprisoned for 17 years based on this DNA evidence. In 2007, a journalist who had been studying the inefficiencies of DNA testing around that time had the DNA retested, and this proved Sugaya's innocence. He was exonerated in 2009, so happy ending for him, despite serving time for a crime he didn't commit. But that's not the end of the tragedy, because the statute of limitations had passed. The actual killer could not be brought to justice, and he's suspected of kidnapping and murdering at least 4 other girls. The year after Sugaya's exoneration, Japan actually abolished the statute of limitations for murder, but it came a little too late for mommy to get justice. We're finally diving into the deepest level of our iceberg, right down to the ocean floor, and we're starting with a doozy. Because did you know that there was a Black Widow of Japan? I didn't. The story of Kanae Kijima isn't just about crime. It's a twisted tale of manipulation, seduction, and betrayal. See, Kojima started off as like your average girl next door. She had a pretty calm upbringing, but she had a dark side. I mean, she was stealing when she was very young because she had plans. She wasn't just a pretty face, she was a siren calling out to lonely hearts, and as she got older, she learned how to use her charm and her body and a great understanding of what men wanted from her to get what she wanted. She convinced herself that she was just giving in to their desires, and if they were willing to pay for her special brand of healing, who was she to say no? She took to dating sites, targeting men who didn't really have much relationship or sexual experience, and she played a game with this. She pretended to be a cultured piano teacher with a taste for the finer things in life, all while planning her deadly endgame. She said, "At the age of 19, I signed my first mistress contract with a man and found that I could give him a different world in sex than the average woman, which led me to want to master the secrets of sexuality. And the amount of money I received and the men I went out with began to move up in class." The result is a trail of men left not only heartbroken, but lifeless, with bank accounts as empty as the promises she fed them. From a self-employed elderly man to an office worker, and one with a taste in fine art. On August 6, 2009, a 41-year-old man was discovered dead from carbon monoxide poisoning using a yonten, which is like a coal briquette, but the suicide seems suspicious. The investigation led police to Kijima, who had been dating the man, and they learned that she had several previous lovers who had also died under mysterious circumstances. By the time she was done, Kijima swindled men out of an amount of money that is equal to almost $8 million US. She's suspected to have murdered 7 different people, but was only convicted for 3. Her trial spanned over 5 years of court dates and appeals, and she even got married in prison while awaiting sentencing. But in April of 2017, the Supreme Court upheld her original sentence of the death penalty. As of now, she's still on death row. Sometimes we forget that a lot of legends are rooted in reality. I mean, we all remember the movie The Ring, right? It was extremely popular in the early 2000s, but did you know that it was based on a true story? Well, maybe a true story. The Himeji Castle murder is one of those stories that's steeped in history, mystery, and the supernatural. In modern times, the fascination with the story came from media in the 90s, a book that was written, and then the early 2000s with the movies. But the actual legend that inspired the story of the ring began much earlier. In the mid-1600s, during the Edo period, a servant girl named Okiku caught the eye of not only the lord of the castle, but also a samurai named Aoyama. Unfortunately to both, Okiku just wasn't interested. Aoyama had it bad, and he doesn't know how to back down. So instead of moving on after being rejected, he concocted a plan that ensured he wouldn't be ignored. He steals this precious plate from the Lord. Now the Lord has 10 of these priceless plates, and so it's very obvious when one is missing. But Aoyama frames Okiku for this crime, basically tries to blackmail her in a "be mine or else I'll make this worse." Now I don't know what you know about Bushido or the way of the samurai, but they were meant to follow a specific code. One of the tenets of that code was honor. I think we can all agree that Aoyama was not a very good samurai. Anyway, Okiku is made of stronger stuff, and she continues to reject the samurai, even knowing that this puts her in danger. He loses it. He orders his men to beat her, tie her up, and he dumps her in the well, leaving her there to die. But that's just the beginning of the story, and if you're familiar with the ring and the source material around it, you already know that. Okiku's spirit rises from the well, haunting the castle with a vengeance. Night after night, she counts those plates. Her screams are echoing through the halls, reminding everyone within of the betrayal she faced. The castle goes into an uproar, people are getting sick, some are even dying, and the Lord is getting desperate. Enter a Buddhist monk. He faces off against the ghostly Okiku, listens, waits, and when she reaches 9, he shouts, 10, finishing the set of plates and giving her the peace she'd been denied. But just when you think it's over, fast forward to 1795, and there's trouble afoot. Wells are infested with what people start calling Okiku bugs, larvae that look eerily like a person tied up. A creepy reminder, a curse from the girl herself, who's to say? But one thing's for sure, Okiku's legacy lives on as a ghostly legend that's as much a part of the walls of Himeji Castle as it is woven into the very fabric of Japanese folklore, and now in modern horror. For this next one, let's leave the castle behind and venture out into the mountains. This story isn't just about getting lost in the wilderness, it's about secrets lost to the eerie silence of the mountains. In 1989, in the vast, unforgiving landscape of Hokkaido, a hiker's paradise, but also a place where nature doesn't play by the rules. Asahidake Mountain, standing proud and daunting, is the backdrop for this tale. Imagine 2 hikers, probably excited to set off on an adventure, but unknowingly walking into a mystery as dense as the forest itself. They get lost, a story old as time, and things get weird. A search party is launched. Helicopters are buzzing through the air, and what do they spot but an SOS message, clear as day on the mountainside. They're relieved, right? The hikers are found, a bit shaken but otherwise safe. A happy end to what could have been a tragic story, right? Not even close. Here's the twist. Those 2 hikers, they're as baffled as everyone else. They aren't the ones who made the SOS message. The plea for help that led to their rescue, not their doing. So who did it? The plot thickens as police dive back into the wintry chill of the mountains, uncovering a scene that's more horror story than rescue mission. They find bones, a backpack, a tape recorder, all scattered around this mysterious SOS message. The bones, after testing, they believe they belong to a woman, tell a tale of a young life cut short. The tapes are a whisper of terror, but the voice on the tapes belongs to a man. He's pleading for help, painting a picture of the nightmare where he's stuck on this mountainside with no way to get off. Here's where it gets more interesting. The police, they're piecing together this puzzle. They're lining up missing persons reports, trying to make sense of the senseless, and every time they think they're getting somewhere, they hit a wall. The bones, the belongings, the unanswered questions, they all lead to a dead end, both literally and figuratively. They eventually find a human skull, a tripod, and a pair of men's basketball shoes at another location, near the SOS message but a ways off. Through the personal belongings they found, they identified the man as Kenji Iwamura. He had been missing since 1984. After re-examining the bones, the police changed their story, believing that all of the bones belonged to Kenji. and that no female hiker had ever been at the scene. It was believed that this SOS message had been there for at least 2 years. Now, it's not all bad news. From this mystery came a glimmer of hope. The limitations of emergency services in the 80s were called into question, and new routes were carved into the mountain, new signs, all to ensure that those who did venture out into the wild would more easily be able to find their way back into civilization, and that cases like Kenji's would not have to be repeated. I don't know about you, but I'm happy to leave the wilderness behind for this next one. This is the story of Yukio Yamaji. Yamaji was living what you might call a pretty tough life in Yamaguchi. As a kid, at just 16 years old, he was already battling a difficult home life, an alcoholic father, a mother who couldn't stop spending what little money they had, and he was stuck in the middle. Things for Yamaji went from bad to worse. He started wandering into toy stores, looking for a sense of normalcy. This wasn't to buy something, he didn't have any money. He just wanted a glimpse of what normal life is like. And if he got a crush on the clerk while he was at it, well, you know, it's just normal teenage stuff. But his mom, I don't know if she was very protective or if she suspected he was doing something he wasn't supposed to. She starts calling the store, checking up on him. Something about her calling the place where the object of his affection was made Yamaji snap. He'd already been fostering some pretty deep-seated resentment for his mother. His father had died a few years earlier from cirrhosis, probably from the drinking, and his relationship with his mother had just gone downhill from there. So what happens next? Yamaji confronts his mother, she denies the phone call, and he grabs a metal bat and beats her with it, and then goes about his life like nothing happened. Cold, detached, as if stepping out of the body of the person who committed the crime and just moving through routines like nothing happened, just a normal teenager. He went to work, he went back to the store to visit his crush, and when he returned home, his mother was dead. Yamaji called the police and was arrested for the crime and sent to juvie. And maybe you might think it was a mistake. Maybe this was a one-time thing, he'd screwed up and he was remorseful. I mean, he called the cops, so he didn't try to hide it. But no, Yamaji didn't learn any lessons in his time locked up, because in 2005, after only being out for about a year or so, he attacked a woman with a knife. She'd been returning home from work, and he had been there lying in wait so he could R-word her and her 19-year-old sister. He killed them both and set the apartment on fire. Yamaji was caught less than a month later, and he told police that he could not forget the feeling of killing his mother, and he wanted to see human blood again. Yamaji was sentenced to death and was executed alongside Hiroshi Maiue, the suicide website murderer, on July 28, 2009. If you made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through our iceberg today. From the surface level all the way down to the ocean floor, we've covered cases that range from the bizarre to the truly terrifying. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe, stay curious, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one. Bye!